He mocked the waitress with a $5 tip. Then her words made him rewrite his will. Some people leave small tips because they're cheap. Others do it because they want to remind someone beneath them exactly where they stand. The chandeliers above Whitmore Steakhouse glowed like frozen gold against the dark Manhattan night, while soft jazz drifted through the crowded dining room. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Expensive watches caught the light every time a hand moved across the white linen tablecloths. Richard Whitmore sat at the center table near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, surrounded by lawyers, investors, and men who laughed half a second too quickly at everything he said. At 63 years old, Richard carried the kind of silence money creates. Cold, heavy, untouchable. His charcoal suit fit perfectly against his broad shoulders, and the silver watch on his wrist cost more than most people in the restaurant made in a year. Yet none of that was what made people nervous around him. It was his eyes. Calm eyes. Measuring eyes. The eyes of a man who had spent 40 years discovering exactly what people would sacrifice for comfort. Across the room, Evelyn Carter balanced a silver tray against one hand as she moved between tables with quiet precision. 29 years old. Blonde hair tied low behind her neck. No flashy makeup. No jewelry except for a tiny silver ring she wore on a chain beneath her uniform collar. Most customers barely noticed her beyond the coffee refills and polite smiles. But the staff noticed. Evelyn never reacted. Not when customers snapped their fingers. Not when businessmen flirted badly after too many bourbons. Not even when someone once called her sweetheart and slid a folded $100 bill into her apron pocket like charity. She had simply handed it back and continued pouring water as if nothing had happened. Table 12 wants another bottle of Napa Reserve, the manager whispered while passing behind her. Evelyn nodded once. I already opened one. You always know before they ask. People usually repeat themselves when they're lonely, she replied softly. The manager stared for a second, confused by the answer, before hurrying away. Near the windows, Richard leaned back in his chair, while one of his younger attorneys finished explaining a merger proposal worth nearly $800 million. Richard barely listened. His attention had shifted toward Evelyn the moment she calmly corrected a bartender who nearly served the wrong wine to a customer without embarrassing him publicly. Interesting, Richard thought. Most people rushed when intimidated. She slowed down. That usually meant one of two things: confidence or exhaustion. Evelyn approached the table carrying fresh coffee. Another pour, gentlemen? Her voice was warm but controlled. Richard looked at her name tag. Evelyn. He watched her refill every cup carefully before finally reaching his. You've worked here long? He asked casually. Almost 3 years. And you still smile at people? A few men at the table laughed politely. Evelyn met his gaze for only a moment. Some people make it easier than others. Another laugh around the table, but this time quieter. Richard noticed something unusual. She hadn't sounded impressed or intimidated. She sounded tired. That interested him even more. Dinner continued for another hour while rain streaked softly against the tall windows outside. The city below looked blurred and distant beneath the storm. Richard barely touched his steak. Instead, he watched Evelyn move through the restaurant with that same calm rhythm, like someone protecting a secret no one else could see. When the check finally arrived, one of the attorneys reached for it automatically. Richard stopped him with a small gesture. I've got it. He opened the leather folder slowly, glanced at the total, then pulled a crisp $5 bill from his wallet and placed it neatly on top. One of the younger men smirked immediately. He knew Richard's little games. The billionaire loved testing people when he grew bored. Richard closed the folder and looked directly at Evelyn as she returned to collect it. For your time, he said smoothly. Then his eyes hardened slightly. Not your service. A few quiet chuckles circled the table. Someone took a sip of whiskey to hide a grin. Evelyn looked down at the lonely $5 bill resting against the black leather folder. She didn't touch it, didn't blink, didn't force a smile. For 3 long seconds, the entire table waited for embarrassment, anger, humiliation. Instead, Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes toward Richard Whitmore, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so soft that everyone at the table leaned forward just to hear it. "A man only tips this way," she said gently. "When he's afraid no one will miss him after he's gone." The laughter disappeared first. Then the sound of silverware. Then even the jazz piano near the bar seemed strangely distant beneath the weight of Evelyn Carter's words. Richard Whitmore remained perfectly still at the center of the table, one hand resting beside his untouched bourbon glass while rain continued sliding down the windows behind him like slow-moving shadows. Nobody looked at Evelyn anymore. They were all looking at him, waiting, watching, measuring how a billionaire responded when someone spoke to him like an ordinary man instead of a monument made of money. One of the younger attorneys cleared his throat awkwardly. "Richard, I think she was just joking." But Evelyn was not smiling. Richard noticed that immediately. There was no satisfaction in her face, no rebellion, no anger. Somehow that unsettled him more than open disrespect would have. She looked at him the way nurses looked at lonely patients in hospital waiting rooms. Calm, observant, almost sad. Richard slowly reached for his bourbon and took a sip without breaking eye contact. "Do you always analyze strangers for free?" he asked quietly. Evelyn finally picked up the leather folder from the table. "Only the ones asking for help." A nervous chuckle escaped from someone near the end of the table, but Richard silenced it with a glance alone. The old billionaire leaned back slightly in his chair while studying her face more carefully now. Her posture never changed. No shaking hands. No nervous apology. Most people cracked after challenging him. She had not even bent. "You think you know me from a tip?" he asked. Evelyn tucked the folder beneath one arm. "No, sir," she replied softly. "I think people reveal themselves in the smallest moments because they forget anyone is paying attention." Richard felt something cold move quietly through his chest. Not anger. Something older than anger. Recognition. For a brief second, he was no longer sitting inside the richest steakhouse in Manhattan. He was 27 again, standing beside a hospital bed while his younger brother Daniel laughed weakly about how rich men always sent flowers instead of showing up in person. Richard blinked once, forcing the memory away before it settled too deeply. "You are very confident for a waitress," one of the investors muttered under his breath. Evelyn turned politely toward him. "No, sir. Just observant." Then she walked away. Simple as that. No dramatic exit. No trembling hands. Just the quiet sound of polished shoes disappearing across marble floors while conversations slowly returned around the restaurant like waves crawling back after a storm. Richard stared after her longer than he intended. "Well," one attorney laughed nervously while adjusting his tie. "That was uncomfortable." Another man smirked. "You finally met someone immune to your little tests." Richard did not answer. His eyes remained fixed toward the bar where Evelyn now poured wine for another customer as if nothing unusual had happened. No stolen glances. No whispered excitement to co-workers. Nothing. It was almost insulting how little she seemed to care about winning. "Who is she?" Richard asked suddenly. "The waitress." "No," Richard replied quietly. "The woman pretending to be a waitress." The table fell silent again, because everyone there understood something dangerous had just happened. Richard Whitmore was curious, and curiosity in a man like him usually became obsession. Across the restaurant, Evelyn carried 2 dessert plates toward a corner booth, where an elderly couple sat sharing coffee beneath a candlelit lamp. The old woman touched Evelyn's wrist gently before she left the table. Richard watched Evelyn kneel slightly beside her so she could hear better over the music. Then the waitress smiled. Not the professional smile she gave customers. A real one. Small, warm, human. Richard looked away almost immediately. Something about it bothered him more than the insult. He suddenly realized he could not remember the last genuine smile directed at him that was not attached to money, obligation, or fear. Outside, thunder rolled softly above Manhattan. Richard loosened his tie slightly for the first time all evening, while his untouched $5 bill remained sitting alone in the center of the empty leather folder like evidence nobody wanted to touch. By 11:30, The dinner crowd had thinned into scattered conversations and half-empty wine glasses, reflecting soft amber light across the restaurant walls. Outside, the rain still covered Manhattan in silver streaks, while black cars crawled slowly through flooded streets below. Richard Whitmore remained seated long after everyone else at his table had left. His attorneys offered polite goodnights. Investors shook hands carefully. One by one, they disappeared into elevators and waiting town cars until only the Billionaire and the quiet hum of the restaurant remained. Richard rarely stayed anywhere after business concluded. Lingering implied loneliness, and loneliness was something powerful men trained themselves to disguise. Yet there he sat, staring at the untouched $5 bill still resting inside the leather folder beside his glass. Finally, he reached forward and folded it once between his fingers. Not because he needed it, because throwing it away suddenly felt impossible. Near the back of the restaurant, Evelyn wiped down a vacant table while another waitress whispered beside her. "What did you say to him?" Evelyn kept cleaning. "Nothing important." Nothing important does not make Richard Whitmore stare at a wall for 20 minutes. Evelyn smiled faintly but did not answer. She simply gathered empty glasses onto her tray and walked toward the kitchen. The other waitress watched her leave with visible confusion. Nobody understood Evelyn completely. Not even the people who worked beside her every night. Richard noticed that too. He stood slowly from his chair, adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal coat, and walked across the dining room with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to entering any space he wanted. Several employees straightened automatically when they saw him approaching. Wealth had gravity. People felt it before words were spoken. Evelyn was placing silverware into polished rows near the service station when Richard stopped beside her. Up close, she looked younger beneath the soft kitchen lights. Tired around the eyes, but not weak. Never weak. "Do you always insult customers after dessert?" he asked quietly. Evelyn continued aligning forks carefully before answering. "Only the ones trying to purchase humiliation for $5. Richard almost smiled. "Almost. You think that is what I was doing?" "I think," she replied calmly, "that wealthy men sometimes confuse control with honesty." Richard studied her profile while the kitchen sounds echoed softly around them. Plates clinked. Water ran somewhere in the distance. A cook laughed briefly before disappearing into silence again. Strange, Richard thought. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with less tension than this conversation beside a tray of silverware. "You talk like a professor," he finally said. Evelyn looked down at the tiny silver ring hanging beneath her collar for only a second before releasing it again. "Life gives everyone an education eventually." "That sounds practiced." "Maybe because it is true." Richard slipped one hand into his coat pocket. "Most people in your position apologize after speaking to me that way." Evelyn finally looked directly at him again. "Most people in my position are afraid of losing something. And you are not?" For the first time that night, something shifted faintly in her expression. Not anger, not fear, grief, small but unmistakable. "I already lost the thing that mattered most," she said softly. Richard felt the answer settle heavily between them. He should have walked away then. Any sensible man would have. But curiosity kept tightening around his thoughts like a slow knot. "What happened to you?" he asked before he could stop himself. Evelyn blinked once, surprised by the question itself more than the words. Then she returned to polishing the silverware in her hands. "People with your kind of money usually ask what happened for entertainment," she said quietly. "Not understanding." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but his phone vibrated sharply inside his coat pocket. He glanced down at the screen. A message from his son, Michael. "You missed Mom's memorial dinner again. 3 years gone and still too busy to show up." Richard stared at the message longer than necessary while something cold moved silently through his chest. Evelyn noticed the change in his face immediately. "Bad news?" she asked softly. Richard locked the screen without answering. Across the room, thunder rolled above the city once more. Then Evelyn looked toward the dark windows and spoke so quietly, he almost thought he imagined it. The people who love us usually stop asking for our time before they stop needing it. This time Richard did not have a response at all. Richard left the restaurant at nearly midnight, but Evelyn's voice followed him all the way down Fifth Avenue like a second shadow beside the rain. The people who love us usually stop asking for our time before they stop needing it. He heard the sentence again as his driver opened the back door of the black Bentley. Again as the city lights reflected across the wet glass beside him. Again as Manhattan blurred past in silver and gold streaks beneath the storm. Richard Whitmore had spent decades training himself not to dwell on words. Words were tools, negotiation pieces, weapons disguised as conversations. But hers felt different, not sharp enough to wound, honest enough to stay. "Home, sir?" the driver asked quietly. Richard loosened his tie slightly while staring out the window. "No," the driver glanced at him through the mirror. "Sir." Richard hesitated for a moment. Strange. He had not hesitated this much over anything in years. "Take me to the cemetery on Lexington." The driver blinked once but nodded immediately. 20 minutes later, cold rain drifted through rows of dark marble headstones, while Richard stood beneath a black umbrella near the grave of his wife, Eleanor Whitmore. The city noise felt far away there, softer, smaller. Eleanor had been dead for 3 years, yet Richard still could not bring himself to visit during daylight. Daytime made grief feel visible, weak. At night, loneliness looked more dignified somehow. Rain tapped softly against the umbrella while he stared at her name carved into polished stone. Eleanor Whitmore, beloved wife, beloved mother. Richard swallowed slowly. The second line always bothered him most. Beloved mother, because their son Michael barely spoke to him anymore. Richard had built towers, companies, foundations with his family name etched into stone. Yet somehow he had failed inside the one building that mattered. Home. His phone vibrated again inside his coat pocket. Another message from Michael. "You did not even answer. Mom would hate what this family became." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Not from anger. Exhaustion. Nearby, thunder rolled quietly above Manhattan, while memories surfaced whether he wanted them or not. Eleanor sitting alone at long dinner tables while he answered business calls. Michael waiting near windows as a child because his father promised to make baseball games he never attended. Daniel, his younger brother, laughing weakly inside that hospital room years ago. "You know what your problem is, Rich?" Daniel had whispered back then with tired eyes and an oxygen tube beneath his nose. "You think success means people will forgive your absence." Richard looked down at Eleanor's grave while rainwater darkened the edges of his polished shoes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to ask a question he normally buried beneath schedules and stock reports. What if they had all been right? Back at Whitmore Steakhouse, Evelyn stepped out through the employee exit into the cold night air with a folded umbrella beneath one arm. Her shift had ended nearly 40 minutes ago, but she always stayed late helping the kitchen staff close. She walked 3 blocks through the rain toward a narrow brick apartment building tucked between an old bookstore and a laundromat. No luxury doorman, no marble lobby, just warm yellow light glowing through old windows. Inside apartment 4B, a soft lamp illuminated stacks of books lining nearly every wall. Philosophy, poetry, history, medical journals with worn corners and handwritten notes tucked between pages. Evelyn quietly removed her wet coat before walking toward the bedroom at the end of the hallway. An older woman slept peacefully beneath a knitted blanket while a small oxygen machine hummed softly nearby. Evelyn crouched beside the bed and adjusted the blanket gently around her mother's shoulders. Then she sat there in silence for a while, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Finally, her mother opened tired eyes halfway. "Long night," she whispered weakly. Evelyn smiled softly. "Just noisy customers." Her mother studied her face carefully despite the dim light. "You have the look again." "What look?" "The one where you pretend something does not hurt you." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. Then she laughed quietly under her breath. "I met a man tonight who has everything except peace." Her mother reached slowly for her hand. "Those are usually the loneliest people." Outside, Rain continued falling over Manhattan while somewhere across the city, Richard Whitmore stood alone beside a grave wondering why a waitress with tired eyes suddenly understood his life better than anyone who had known him for decades. Richard Whitmore did not sleep that night. At 3:17 in the morning, the lights inside the top floor of Whitmore Tower still glowed against the dark Manhattan skyline, while rain tapped softly against 40-foot windows overlooking the city he once believed he controlled. His penthouse looked exactly the way architectural magazines loved to describe powerful men. Minimalist, expensive, immaculate, and painfully empty. Richard stood near the fireplace with a glass of untouched scotch in one hand while Evelyn Carter's words continued circling his thoughts like slow-moving smoke. A man only tips this way when he is afraid no one will miss him after he is gone. He hated how accurate it sounded. More importantly, he hated that she had seen it within minutes. Across the room, a massive oil portrait of Eleanor Whitmore hung above the piano she used to play every Sunday evening before cancer hollowed her body faster than money could save it. Richard looked toward the portrait for a long moment before quietly setting the glass aside untouched. He walked toward his office instead. Dark walnut shelves lined the walls beside framed awards and photographs from decades of corporate victories. Presidents, governors, magazine covers, handshakes worth billions. Yet none of the photographs included Michael smiling naturally anymore. Richard noticed that suddenly. Every recent family picture looked posed, performed, empty. He lowered himself slowly into the leather chair behind his desk and opened the bottom drawer where he kept documents nobody else touched. Property records, trust agreements, his will. The thick envelope rested exactly where his attorneys left it 6 months earlier. Richard stared at it without moving, then finally slid it onto the desk. Outside, thunder murmured softly over Manhattan while he flipped through pages assigning houses, stock shares, and foundations to people he barely trusted. Everything looked organized, strategic, efficient, and somehow completely soulless. A quiet memory surfaced unexpectedly. Michael at 10 years old sitting beside the kitchen counter building a crooked birdhouse with glue all over his hands while Eleanor laughed in the background. "Dad," the boy had asked proudly back then, "if you died tomorrow, what would everybody remember about you?" Richard had laughed at the childish question without looking up from his phone. "Hopefully that I built something important." But Michael shook his head immediately. "No, I mean something real." Richard closed the will slowly now while tension tightened behind his ribs. Somewhere over the years, he had stopped knowing the difference. Across the city, morning light slowly entered Evelyn's apartment through old lace curtains, while the scent of coffee drifted quietly from the kitchen. Evelyn stood beside the stove wearing a loose gray sweater while reviewing handwritten medical bills spread across the counter. Her mother sat nearby wrapped in a blanket, reading from a worn poetry book with reading glasses balanced low on her nose. "You should sleep more," her mother murmured gently. Evelyn smiled faintly without looking up. "You should stop pretending your medicine tastes fine." Her mother laughed softly. The sound filled the small apartment with warmth richer than anything inside Whitmore Tower. Then the older woman studied her daughter carefully over the edge of the book. "You are thinking about him again." Evelyn paused while stirring cream into her coffee. "I am thinking about what happens to people when nobody tells them the truth for too long." "And you think that is your responsibility?" "No," Evelyn looked down at the bills spread across the counter. "But sometimes lonely people mistake honesty for cruelty because they are not used to hearing either one." Her mother reached across the table slowly and covered Evelyn's hand with her own. "Be careful with wounded people, sweetheart. Especially the rich ones. They can spend their whole lives avoiding mirrors." Later that afternoon, Richard Whitmore canceled 3 board meetings for the first time in nearly 20 years. His assistant nearly dropped her tablet in shock. "Sir, are you feeling well?" Richard buttoned his coat calmly while staring toward the cloudy skyline outside his office window. "No," he answered honestly. Then he picked up his car keys himself instead of calling for a driver. "But I think I finally want to be." The next evening, Whitmore Steakhouse moved with its usual polished rhythm. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath golden light. Expensive perfume lingered softly through the air. Wall Street conversations floated from table to table like carefully rehearsed theater. But the staff noticed something unusual almost immediately. Richard Whitmore had returned. Alone. "That cannot be good," one bartender whispered while polishing a glass. "Maybe he came back to complain." "About what?" Another server muttered quietly. "Having emotions?" Near the kitchen entrance, Evelyn tied her apron slowly, without reacting to the whispers around her. She had seen wealthy men return before, usually for one of two reasons: ego or loneliness. Sometimes both arrived together. "You want me to take his table?" another waitress asked carefully. Evelyn shook her head once. "No, it is fine." Across the dining room, Richard sat at the same table near the windows where rain no longer covered the city. Tonight Manhattan glowed clear and cold beneath a dark blue sky. He wore another charcoal suit, another expensive watch, another expression practiced carefully enough to hide exhaustion from everyone except people trained to notice it. Evelyn approached with a glass of water and a menu tucked beneath one arm. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Richard looked up at her quietly. "You remembered my name. The city puts your face on enough magazines to make forgetting difficult." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing again. "And yet you still speak to me like a normal person." Evelyn placed the water down carefully. "That is usually the safest way to speak to lonely men." Richard exhaled slowly through his nose while glancing toward the skyline beyond the windows. "You seem very determined to insult me politely." "No," Evelyn replied calmly. "I think you are determined to hear insults where honesty should be." For a moment neither spoke. Soft piano music drifted through the restaurant while candlelight flickered gently across the polished table between them. Finally Richard closed the menu without opening it. "Sit down for a minute." Evelyn glanced toward the crowded dining room. "I am working." "So am I," Richard replied quietly. "I just finally realized I am terrible at it." That surprised her enough to pause. After a moment, she slipped carefully into the chair across from him. Though her posture remained alert, professional, ready to stand again at any second. Richard studied her for a long moment before speaking. "What did you mean yesterday?" "About what?" "When you said the people who love us stop asking for our time before they stop needing it." Evelyn folded her hands together loosely on the table. "Exactly what it sounded like." Richard looked down briefly at the untouched water glass beside him. "My son barely speaks to me anymore." Evelyn said nothing. He noticed she never rushed to fill silence. Most people panicked around it. She respected it. "I spent 30 years building companies," Richard continued quietly. "I thought providing for my family meant succeeding for them. And now," he laughed once beneath his breath. "Bitter. Small. Now I think I built beautiful things for people I forgot to sit beside." Evelyn watched him carefully while soft light reflected in her pale blue eyes. "Children remember presents more than sacrifice," she said gently. "Especially when the sacrifice was never asked for." Richard swallowed slowly. Strange. Billion-dollar negotiations had never made him feel this exposed. "You speak like someone who lost somebody too." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly toward the silver ring resting beneath her collar. "My father spent his whole life chasing bigger opportunities," she said softly. "By the time he slowed down enough to notice us, my mother was already sick and I had already learned how to stop expecting him home." Richard felt the words settle heavily between them. Not dramatic, not angry, just true. Somehow truth hurt more when spoken quietly. "Did he ever regret it?" Richard asked after a long silence. Evelyn looked toward the glowing skyline beyond the windows before answering. "Every day." Then she stood slowly from the table as another server signaled from across the restaurant. "I should get back to work." Richard nodded automatically, but before she could leave, he spoke again. "Evelyn." She turned slightly. "Yes." Richard hesitated. The next words sounded unfamiliar in his own mouth. "What if it is too late to fix things?" Evelyn studied him for a moment with an expression so calm it almost felt merciful. "People usually ask that question," she said softly. when they are finally ready to stop protecting their pride. Then she walked away again, leaving Richard Whitmore alone at the table with a question no amount of money had ever been able to answer for him before. Richard Whitmore sat alone in his penthouse long after midnight again, but this time the silence felt different, less protected, more honest. The city stretched endlessly beneath the glass walls around him while traffic lights flickered red and white far below like distant embers. In front of him rested two things he had avoided for years: his phone and his son's contact name, Michael Whitmore. Richard stared at it for nearly 5 full minutes before finally pressing call. The line rang twice, then a third time. Voicemail. Richard almost ended the call immediately. Pride still lived stubbornly inside him like an old scar that refused to heal properly. But then he heard the automated beep. Michael. His voice sounded rougher than expected. Older. It is Dad. Silence filled the room around him while he searched for words that did not sound rehearsed. I know I missed the memorial dinner. He paused. I know I missed a lot of things. Another silence. The kind that forces a man to hear himself clearly. I used to think providing for this family meant protecting it financially. But lately I have started wondering if I was just protecting myself from being present. Richard lowered his eyes toward the dark city below. You once asked me what people would remember about me after I died. A faint laugh escaped him. I gave you a terrible answer. His grip tightened slightly around the phone. I do not know if you are ready to talk to me. Honestly, I do not know if I deserve it yet. But I would like to try. Another long pause. Softer this time. Your mother deserved better from me. So did you. Richard swallowed hard before finishing quietly. Call me someday if you want to, or do not. But either way, I am sorry. He ended the voicemail slowly and sat there motionless afterward, staring at his own reflection in the glass. Strange. He had delivered speeches to shareholders worth billions of dollars without his heartbeat changing once. Yet leaving a voicemail for his own son felt like stepping barefoot onto broken glass. Across Manhattan, Evelyn closed the restaurant just after midnight and stepped outside into cold autumn air carrying a small paper bag of leftover bread rolls for a homeless shelter 2 blocks away. The streets glistened beneath fresh rain while steam curled from subway grates into the dark. Halfway down the sidewalk, headlights swept slowly across the curb beside her. Richard's Bentley rolled quietly to a stop. Evelyn looked over immediately, unsurprised somehow. Richard stepped out from the back seat himself instead of waiting for a driver. His coat hung loosely over his shoulders, and for the first time since meeting him, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a tired man carrying invisible weight. You wait outside restaurants often? Evelyn asked calmly. Richard glanced toward the paper bag in her hands. You feed strangers often? Only the hungry ones. That almost made him smile again. Almost. I left my driver at home tonight, he admitted quietly. I needed to think. Evelyn studied him carefully beneath the glow of the street lamp. And did it help? Richard looked toward the dark avenue stretching ahead of them. Not really. Then he hesitated before adding, but I called my son. Something softened faintly in Evelyn's eyes at that. That matters. He did not answer. That also matters. Richard exhaled slowly into the cold night air. You make everything sound simple. Evelyn shook her head gently. No. I just think people complicate apologies because they are afraid humility makes them smaller. A taxi rushed past nearby, spraying water against the curb while silence settled between them again. Richard noticed something then. Evelyn never rushed to comfort him, never tried to flatter him. She simply allowed truth to exist without decorating it. It was strangely rare. Why do you care? He asked quietly. About any of this? Evelyn looked down briefly at the silver ring hanging beneath her collar. Because someone once cared enough to tell me the truth when I needed it. Richard followed her gaze. Your father. She shook her head once. No, then she looked back up at him beneath the pale glow of the street lamp. Your brother. Richard froze completely. The city noise around them seemed to disappear all at once. What? Evelyn reached slowly beneath her collar and pulled the silver ring free on its chain. Tiny initials were engraved inside the worn metal. D. W. Richard's breath caught instantly. Daniel Whitmore. His younger brother's initials. The ring Daniel never took off before cancer stole him 8 years earlier. Richard stared at the ring like he was seeing a ghost. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. Richard Whitmore stared at the silver ring in Evelyn's hand as if time itself had stopped moving around them. Traffic lights changed. Horns echoed somewhere down the avenue. Cold wind carried the scent of rain through the city streets. None of it reached him anymore. His eyes remained fixed on the tiny engraved initials inside the worn silver band. D. W. Daniel Whitmore. His younger brother's ring. The one Richard personally placed beside Daniel's hospital bed the night before he died because chemotherapy had made his fingers too thin to wear it anymore. Richard looked up slowly, confusion and disbelief colliding across his face for the first time in years without restraint. "That ring belonged to my brother," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded once. "I know." "How?" Her fingers closed gently around the chain before she answered. 8 years ago, my mother collapsed at the grocery store 2 blocks from Columbia University. I was 19. We had no insurance left and nowhere to go. Richard listened without interrupting. "Most people walked around us," Evelyn continued softly. "Some stared. Some pretended not to notice." Her eyes drifted briefly toward the glowing windows above the avenue before returning to him again. But one man stopped. Richard already knew the answer before she said the name. Somehow that made hearing it hurt more. "Daniel." The city suddenly felt very quiet around them. Evelyn smiled faintly at the memory. "He sat on the sidewalk with my mother for almost 40 minutes while we waited for an ambulance." Richard swallowed hard. That sounded exactly like Daniel. "He stayed at the hospital too," Evelyn continued, "long after he should have left." Her voice softened further. "He noticed I was reading one of his philosophy books while my mother slept." Richard looked down briefly, remembering the stacks of books that used to cover Daniel's apartment. Poetry, ethics, history. Daniel always said people revealed themselves by what they reread, not what they displayed publicly. "Your brother paid for my mother's medication for nearly 6 months," Evelyn said quietly. "But he made the hospital promise never to tell us his full name." Richard closed his eyes for one brief moment. Of course Daniel would do that too. "Then how did you find out?" Evelyn looked down at the ring resting against her palm. "A nurse gave me this after he passed away." Richard's expression tightened immediately. "Passed away?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "I did not know who he was until years later when I saw his obituary in a magazine at the dentist office." A faint breeze lifted strands of her blonde hair beneath the street lamp while she continued. "By then my mother was stable again. I was back in school. Everything in my life had changed because one stranger stopped long enough to care." Richard stared at the ring while emotion moved visibly through his face now, breaking apart decades of practiced control piece by piece. "Daniel never told me any of this," he whispered. Evelyn's expression turned thoughtful. "I do not think he wanted credit." Richard laughed softly beneath his breath. Painfully. "That sounds like him." Silence settled between them again while headlights passed slowly across wet pavement nearby. Then Evelyn looked directly at him. "Your brother understood something you forgot somewhere along the way." Richard lifted his eyes toward her carefully. "What?" Evelyn's voice remained calm, gentle, but impossible to ignore. "People do not remember who had the biggest office." She paused. "They remember who sat beside them when life became unbearable." Richard felt the sentence land inside him with terrifying precision because suddenly he understood why Daniel had always seemed lighter than him despite having less money, less status, less power. Daniel had been loved without needing to earn it. Richard looked toward the dark skyline above Manhattan while grief rose slowly through his chest, raw and unfamiliar after years buried beneath schedules and acquisitions. "I spent my whole life trying to become the successful brother," he admitted quietly. Evelyn shook her head softly. "Maybe he spent his life trying to become the present one." Richard looked at her again then. Really looked at her. Not as a waitress, not as a stranger who challenged him, but as someone carrying a piece of his brother's kindness through the world years after Daniel was gone. And somehow that realization hurt more beautifully than anything Richard Whitmore had felt in decades. 3 weeks later, the first snow of December drifted quietly across Manhattan like falling ash beneath the morning light. Whitmore Tower stood wrapped in pale gray clouds while inside the top-floor conference room, 6 attorneys sat in complete silence around a polished walnut table staring at Richard Whitmore as if they no longer recognized him. "You want to amend all of it?" the senior attorney asked carefully. Richard stood near the windows overlooking the city with both hands resting inside his coat pockets. He looked older lately, not weaker, just less armored. "Everything," he answered calmly. Confused glances moved around the room immediately. One attorney adjusted his glasses nervously. "Sir, this changes nearly 40% of your estate structure." Richard nodded once. "Good. Your shareholders may question such dramatic philanthropic redistribution." Richard finally turned toward them fully. "I did not ask what shareholders would think." The room fell silent again. On the table beside him rested a new version of his will. Millions redirected toward scholarships, community hospitals, caregiver assistance programs, quiet things, human things. There was even a handwritten letter sealed separately for Michael. No legal language, no financial instructions, just words Richard should have said years earlier. "Sir," another attorney asked cautiously, "what brought about this sudden shift?" Richard looked down briefly at the silver fountain pen in his hand, then toward the falling snow outside the windows. "I met someone," he said quietly, "who reminded me that generosity without presence is just organized guilt." No one spoke after that, because somehow the billionaire sounded freer than any of them had ever seen him before. Across town, Whitmore Steakhouse buzzed with holiday decorations and soft Christmas music while Evelyn carried coffee refills between crowded tables. Life had returned to normal on the surface. Customers still complained about reservations. Executives still measured importance through watches and wine bottles. But something inside her felt lighter lately. Her mother's health had stabilized. The medical bills no longer arrived in frightening stacks every month. And somewhere in the city, a lonely man had finally started telling the truth to himself. "Evelyn," the manager called from across the restaurant. "There is a delivery for you." She frowned slightly before walking toward the front counter where a small cream-colored envelope rested beside a vase of white lilies. No name outside, just elegant handwriting. She opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. Daniel Whitmore standing beside a younger Richard nearly 30 years earlier, both laughing at something outside the frame. Real laughter, unprotected, human. Folded behind the photograph was a single handwritten note. Evelyn recognized Richard's handwriting immediately. Strong, precise, slightly uneven near the end. "My brother spent his life teaching people how to feel seen. Somehow, after all these years, you continued his work without ever realizing it. You gave me back the only inheritance that truly mattered. My humanity." Evelyn read the words twice while soft Christmas music played faintly around her. Then her eyes drifted toward the final line at the bottom of the page. "P.S. Michael called me yesterday. We are having dinner Sunday." For the first time in weeks, Evelyn smiled without sadness hiding behind it. Small, quiet, real. Outside the restaurant windows, snow continued falling gently across Manhattan, while strangers hurried past carrying shopping bags and coffee cups without noticing the tiny moments changing other people's lives beside them. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and tucked it beside the silver ring beneath her collar. Then she returned to work carrying another tray of coffee through the warm golden light of the restaurant. Near the corner booth, an elderly customer struggled to put on his gloves while balancing a cane beside the table. Before he could ask for help, Evelyn quietly set her tray down and knelt beside him with patient hands and a soft smile. No cameras noticed. No applause followed. Just kindness moving quietly from one person to another the same way Daniel Whitmore once passed it to her. And somewhere across the city, Richard Whitmore sat alone inside his enormous dining room waiting nervously for his son to arrive for dinner, realizing at last that being remembered had never depended on how much money a man left behind, only how much warmth he left inside the people who survived him.